serving as military specialist for Carleton County. I'm going to give you the next presentation on the World War One Canadians timeline. This is about Canada in the First World War. So this time we're talking about the Battle of Festubert, which was actually it's one of the major parts of the full battle of the Second Battle of Artois in 1915, spring of 1915. And of course, the Battle of Festubert was the second major engagement fought by Canadian troops in the First World War. So, first being you have, of course, the Second Battle of Ypres. There's a major involvement in the Second Battle of Artois, of course, with Festubert being a major engagement for Canadians. Um, so the battle, the Festubert, took place in May 1915 as part of the fighting around Artois, France. So the Second Battle of Artois involved Festubert. The German army was moving reinforcements into the region to mount a large summer offensive, and the Allied attacks were meant to disrupt their plans. So the 1st Canadian Division, along with the 51st Highland Division from Scotland, attacked on May 18th. The attack on Festubert was the very image of a grim World War One battlefield. The Canadians attacked without proper maps, time to prepare, or artillery support. They charged directly into German guns again and again, taking terrible losses. Over the next week, the battle continued. Though the Canadians kept fighting, their spirit was no match for German steel and explosives. In the final tally, the Canadians had traded 2,107 dead and wounded for less than a kilometer of ground. The 1st Canadian Division learned a terrible lesson at Festubert, but unfortunately it would take even greater losses at St. Etoile and Mount Sorrel before those lessons translated into a change of strategy and tactics in the Canadian Corps. Here's just one picture of the Festubert area. Just totally just ripped apart by our heavy artillery. 3-pounders, 6-pounders. You've got heavy guns both sides. So Festubert 1915 was a battle honor granted for participation in this action near the town of Festubert in May 1915. One of the 1st Canadian Division's first offensive actions on the Western Front during the First World War. In late April and May of 1915, while the 2nd British Army fought to defend Ypres, even while the possession of Vreesenberg Ridge remained in doubt, the right wing of the First Army began a cooperative venture with the French in Artois, where a German salient 7 miles wide and 4 miles deep had been formed. Of particular concern were the heights of the Vimy Ridge, forming a 5-mile wide barrier. An 8-division assault went in on 9th of May, leading to an inconclusive struggle that saw the ridge remain in German hands. The Germans' initial deployment had been just 2 divisions. The French fought until the 15th of May, losing about 100,000 men in a grinding action that nonetheless secured 16 square kilometers of tactical importance that confronted the German army with a major operational problem. However, while troops had been pushed to the lower slopes of the ridge, the heights overlooking the Dour Plain remained in German hands and would remain so until the famous Canadian assault in April 1917 at Vimy Ridge. Here you see the front lines, May 1915, May 17th, and of course this is a 1-kilometer mark here. That's Festubert, Rue des Bois, Princess Road, and then you can see here from Stafford Corner, and the front lines. What was moved from there to the front lines here, 25th of May 1915. So Alba's Ridge. The British contribution to the offensive had been attempts by the First Army to breach the German line north and south of Neuve-Chapelle, which we had talked about earlier, at points 6,000 yards apart, followed by converging attacks at the Aubers Ridge, 3,000 yards beyond. We talked about Aubers Ridge a bit. And ultimately seizing the La Bassée-Lille road up to the line of the Haute Canal, the Haute Canal. Sorry if I'm butchering that word, the name rather. A distance of 6 miles from the start line. Efforts to find the right tactical solutions were still being made, while the French had changed their philosophy on artillery preparations, shifting from short bombardments to longer concentrations of fire. The British opted for a pre-attack bombardment of only 40 minutes, a decision influenced by shortages of heavy guns and ammunition, a problem exacerbated by shell usage at Ypres. And that was a problem, definitely. At Ypres, it really showed it. There was hope that surprise might be maintained as a factor for the attacking infantry. Additional study on the Battle of Neuve-Chapelle suggested other tactical improvements, failure by British guns to give rapid and accurate support when strong points barred the way led to trench mortars and 3-pounder mountain guns being carried in trucks and armored cars. Work was done in advance by the infantry in preparing assembly trenches and jumping off points, and ensuing assault equipment and adequate reserves of ammunition, rations, and engineer stores were provided. There was confidence among British senior leadership that, with proper planning and registration of enemy trenches by friendly artillery, sectors of the enemy line could be captured with relatively few casualties. However, the Germans opposite had doubled the width of their barbed wire emplacements, strengthened breastworks, and carefully sighted machine guns, two per battalion, firing at ground level through steel rail loopholes. Dugouts 200 yards behind the main line held platoon-sized groups of men ready to occupy the front line once the Allied shelling stopped, and half a mile behind that were concrete machine gun nests 1,000 yards apart, designed to serve as rallying points in the event of an Allied breakthrough. At 5 a.m., the opening bombardment, fired by 600 guns, went into action, and at 5:40 a.m. the leading assault troops began to cross 200 yards of no man's land in 6 lines 50 yards apart. The men spaced 3 paces apart. In the face of French demands that the British meet their commitments, the First Army recognized the need to continue operations, a need made more acute by events on the Eastern Front, which had caused German divisions to depart the front opposite the French. Nonetheless, the failure at Aubers Ridge convinced the First Army's commander, General Haig, that 2 attacks could not be maintained simultaneously, and therefore resources were concentrated on the 3-mile front between Neuve-Chapelle and Festubert. A small village 1.5 miles north of La Bassée Canal. The commander of the British Expeditionary Force, Sir John French, agreed at this time to the First Army extending its front south of the canal in order that a French division might be freed for the action at Vimy Ridge. Therefore, the Canadian division, reorganizing after the Second Ypres battle, was selected to relieve the French 58th Division. However, their artillery was still fighting at Ypres and Proxtut, and so the 1st British Division made the relief instead. Again, experience in battle was assessed, and changes to tactics introduced. The disaster that had occurred at Ridge had demonstrated the strength of German defenses on the front, as well as the ability of the German machine guns to mutually support each other. In recognition of these factors, the British opted now for longer, methodical bombardments by heavy guns and howitzers, with the intention of observing fall of shot. These are some pictures, a few pictures here coming up of Aber's Ridge. The plan. So instead of planning an advance of 3 kilometers to Aber's Ridge, General Haig was now intent on moving forward about a kilometer as far as Le Quincururi. Yeah, sorry, I butchered that name. Running eastwards out of Festubert. The infantry would still attack 2 positions simultaneously, but there would be only 500 meters or so between the pincers, as opposed to the kilometer previously tried. Major General Hubert Gauff's 7th Division would attack from north of Festubert, while the Major General Henry Horn's 2nd Division would advance out of the Rue de Bois north from Chocolate Miniere Corner, named after an advertising hoarding, supported by a brigade from the Indian Corps on his left. No, I didn't write any of this. So this is all coming from the from the pages from CanadianSoldiers.com. A great wealth of information. I turned it into basically an operational speaking presentation, and so that's what I'm doing with a lot of these presentations online. Doing some of the slideshows with some videos and onward to make presentations on data that's been presented and public information. So I want to thank CanadianSoldiers.com for their wealth of great knowledge. Continuing on, as the second division already knew the area well, General Horn proposed that they carry out a night attack to gain the German front line and then wait on the 7th Division's attack in daylight. General Haig ordered that the bombardment by 121 howitzers and 312 field guns should open on the morning of the 13th of May 1915 and continue relentlessly throughout that and the following day. The batteries were registered onto their targets with forward observers noting that many of the howitzers' shells were still failing to explode. The munitions available allowed for about 100 rounds per field gun per day and half that for the howitzers. In other words, 4 or just 2 rounds every hour. It was only possible to shell those positions on the front to be attacked. It was also possible to shell those positions on the front to be attacked. The flanks to be left untouched. Only possible for the front instead of the flanks. Over the next 60 hours, the British guns would fire off 100,000 rounds, a formidable number at this stage of the war, and one which would require weeks of manufacture to replace. The clear weather turned miserable on the 12th of May, which made observing the effects of the bombardment difficult. As it cleared again on the morning of the 14th, the eve of battle, General Haig asked his divisional commanders if they were happy that enough had been done to render success reasonably certain. Gough was confident. Horn was worried that the now sodden ground might prove an obstacle, whilst Lieutenant General Anderson of the assisting Merit Division was far more skeptical. I do not consider sufficient damage has been done to ensure success of the assault tonight, nor from the artillery report is it likely to be completed in time? With Sir John French's agreement, General Haig postponed his attack by 24 hours, increasing the bombardment from 36 to 60 hours. Saturday on the 15th of May turned out to be bright and sunny, and the attacking formations moved into position. Surprise was out of the question, but a few decoy runs had been planned into the barrage in the hope that when the assault began, the Germans would not realize that this time the crescendo was for real. The 60-hour bombardment that prefaced the Battle of Festubert began on the morning of 13th of May, 1915, when 433 howitzers and guns began a systematic working over of German defenses on the frontage of 5,000 yards extending north from the village itself. The fire was slow and deliberate, just 50 rounds per gun every 24 hours, in keeping with Haig's desire that effects on the German defenses could be observed. The 6-inch guns fired on the German parapet, while 4.5-inch guns shelled support and communications trenches. Field guns bombarded wire entanglement and dropped harassing fire in the form of shrapnel shells into communication trenches. The fire was originally to last just 36 hours, but extended another 24 at the request of one of the assault divisions. The First Corps used just over 100,000 rounds of ammunition in total. The infantry launched their assault on the night of the 16th of May 1915. On the left, the 2nd Division attacked at midnight on a frontage of 1,300 yards, with the Merit Division of the Indian Corps covering their left flank. At daybreak, the 7th Division, new to the sector and unfamiliar with the ground, and thus unable to participate in night operations, was scheduled to join in on the right, attacking on a frontage of half a mile, during which time the 2nd Division would again advance to the second objective, the line of La Quincurui, a road running northeast out of Festubert. The German 14th Infantry Division was manning the line south of the La Bassée Canal to the Ferme des Bois, a wood 2 miles northeast of Festubert, wooded area. The division comprised 3 infantry regiments, the 16th, 56th, and 57th, while opposite the Indian Corps was the 13th Division. So you got 2nd Division here, Lahore Division here, Indian Corps here, and if you're going that way down, that's on your left. It's on my right, and then 1st Corps here, and 7th Corps, and the German the German 14th Division up from here, the German trenches, and these are the Allied trenches. Festubert marked the first British night attack of the war, and it was partially successful, the right brigade achieving the German breastwork soundlessly. But on the northern flank, the planned demonstration by the Lahore Division, who fired small arms in an attempt to divert the Germans' attention, only managed to alert the enemy that an operation was underway, and both of the assault brigades on the left were driven back by heavy fire. Here you can see the position of 7th Division, 3rd Canadian Brigade, 14th Battalion, and 2nd Division here, 21st Brigade here. The British front on the 17th of May 1915 is here, up along this line. And they're pushing in an Indian village here, and they're pushing in downward and flanking left. The 7th Division began its attack at 3:15 a.m. a barrage of field artillery preceding it, and the right-hand brigade managed to arrive at the final objective on La Quenque Rue. Determined fire elsewhere on the axis of advance halted the assault units, in particular from untouched German positions in the gap between the sectors of the 2nd and 7th Divisions. The divisions tried twice to tie their flanks in during the 16th of May, but failed. Nonetheless, the Germans discarded any notion of regaining their lost trenches, and the divisional commander of the 14th Infantry Division pulled back on a 3,000-yard frontage. They formed a new line of resistance 500 yards behind Le Quinquereux, which for several days the British were unable to identify with accuracy opposite Festubert. The new line swung west as it wound north of the village, and including strong positions from Frem de Boise. The German withdrawal was seen as evidence that resistance was breaking down, and at mid-morning on 17th of May, General Haig gave fresh orders to the First Corps to consolidate along La Quinquereux, with brigade commanders permitted to continue pressing if opportunities presented themselves. Simultaneously, the army commander put the 3rd Canadian Brigade at the disposal of the First Corps, who in turn put it in divisional reserve of the 7th Division. So they became the reserve. The 7th Division put them into reserve and behind and ready. For the Canadian battalions, the battle promised new challenges. The battalions were to attack over a country we had never seen before, and depending on guides from the troops in line, rather than on the inaccurate map which showed the same symbol for hedges, paths, and ditches, was printed with the south at the top and the grid inverted. Points of interest, such as buildings and road junctions, were marked with letters and numerals within a circle. M10 encircled and pronounced, and you can see somewhere up here, M10. It's on one of the maps here. Okay. As I continue reading, Haig's orders were not issued until mid-afternoon and received by the infantry brigade as 0 hour approached. The 2-hour preliminary bombardment was an hour late in starting, originally scheduled for 2:30 p.m. The Canadian attack did not go forward until 5:25 p.m., by which time the Guards Brigade had already been halted by German machine guns, scarcely touched by the British artillery due to their positions still not having been precisely located. And as you can see here, units are pressing forward, and then they push the Germans back some. Of course, then they're pushed back themselves. So you can see your 7th Division, 22nd Brigade, 20th Brigade, and these are, of course, the German 14th Infantry Division, 14th Division, and their positions here: 55th IR, 57th IR. The 14th Battalion, which attacked with A and C Company forward, to their left the Guards Brigade, and to their right the 16th Battalion, told not to expect serious opposition. They moved into the former German front line and set off immediately into heavy shell and machine gun fire with an officer from 1/8th Royal Scots as a guide, aiming at a position known as the Orchard as their objective. Lieutenant Colonel Burland, in charge of the assault companies, ordered the line to halt in the face of the devastating German fire and attempt to dig in. They were ordered on the night of the 19th of May to hand over their positions to the Guards and pull A and C companies back to the former German line where B and D companies had remained in reserve. Both the attack and the withdrawal were made under trying conditions, in darkness, under constant fire, and across waterlogged countries seamed with deep ditches and old trenches. Some 65 other ranks were casualties, most of them fatal, including 18 non-commissioned officers. The 14th Battalion remained in support trenches until the 22nd May under constant shell fire, losing 75 other ranks killed and wounded, as well as one officer killed and another wounded while attached to the 13th Battalion. The Montrealers of the 14th Battalion had met fire from the same unlocated machine guns that had harried the Guards and were diverted south, halted about 400 yards from their jumping off trenches. The 16th Battalion Canadian Scottish had an adventure just assembling for the attack. In the early hours of 17th of May, after the 3rd Brigade had received its orders attaching it to the 7th Division, the battalions had deployed in assembly trenches, while the battalion COs assembled for a brigade conference. The brigadier desired to concentrate the 4 Canadian battalions at a cluster of houses known as Indian Village, but no roads connected the current billet site. Requesting a cross-country march, the reconnaissance parties from each battalion returned after the brigade had been stood down. And at 8 p.m., so 2000 hours, the 4 battalions marched 5 miles through steady rain to new billets, a trek of 2 hours. The last troops were able to turn in by 1 a.m. on the 18th of May, and new orders arrived at 400 hours, with demands that the brigade return to Indian Village. Officers of the 16th noted that the men were dead tired when they set out at 6:45 a.m., and the trip cross-country took until 4 p.m., so that would be 1600 hours. As if that wasn't bad enough, number 4 company was detailed to make an end around march back through Festubert and up at La Quinquevue to make a flanking attack on the orchard. A circuitous trip, of some 5,000 yards. Some of the machine guns you see here are the Vickers Mark I, which is 303 British. Usually it's a crew-served machine gun, water or air-cooled. A lot of these machine guns are, roughly around... The rate of fire of these is roughly 500 rounds a minute, 450 to 500 rounds a minute. Effective firing round is around 2,000 meters. The maximum firing range is 4,500 yards. I mean, these are a good machine gun. These are good machine guns. These are what they call crew-served machine guns. Usually it's one man operating. The other man is bringing up ammunition or feeding the ammunition, and the other man is cooling it and also ready to help transport. All 3 of them help transport that to and from different positions. So that's why it's called crew-served. So it's a recoil system with gas boost. So it's gas operating boost system is the recoil, and of course the feed system is a canvas belt, roughly around 250 rounds. So, of course, the other weapons that you see here from one of the Indian units from the Indian Division at Battle of Festubert. These are the number 1 Mark III Lee Enfields, roughly at max around 1,000-yard range. And these are good. Effective firing range roughly 1,000 meters. Some models are good, say 550 yards effective, but I mean, you can really, I mean, see the machine gun, it's not accurate. You're spraying effectively to a certain mile, a certain kilometers. certain yardage, and then your rifle though accuracy, you can have maximum around 1,000 yards, and that's usually a lot of times that'd be very good with iron sights, but with scoped it's even better for a marksman. Um, they fire the same round. They're 3-3 British, um, and bolt action. So you can carry 5-round internal magazines, or usually called clips that come up the top. Magazines are at the bottom, but that's what they're firing there. It was a complex plan, and a number of other variables threatened to unravel things, in addition to the inaccurate maps, incomplete, more like it as well, printed upside down and with poor iconography. The frontal attack was to be made over ground laced with deep drainage ditches and abandoned German and Allied breastworks. Entrenchments built up above ground because of the shallow water table, which had ruled out the digging of trenches. Number 4 Company also had to rendezvous with a British staff officer somewhere in Festubert, as he was the only person who knew where the start line for their attack was going to be. Number 4 Company was heavily shelled while passing through Festubert and broke into small parties to run the gauntlet. Their escort, a soldier from the Queen's Own Cameroon Highlanders, assured them of the staff officer's presence, but he never made the rendezvous, and the map was of no use in locating either the objective of the orchard or a communication trench that the company was to use for cover in its advance. The company commander ordered his men to drop their packs and take in a chance on finding the trench, which was soon discovered on setting out. They advanced to link up with the survivors of the frontal assault to be informed of its failure. Here you see the red underneath the blue is the 3rd Canadian Brigade. This is from the battalion, the 16th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Force. This is the shoulder patch, what they call the shoulder cloth that goes on the shoulders. It's a Expeditionary Force markings, so they would recognize this as the 16th, which is marked in blue. So of course, if you're looking at the 13th Battalion, it's a blue circle above a bright red patch. 14th is a half large circle, um, and that's Canadian Expeditionary Force. That's the 14th Battalion. Large half circle over a big red patch like this here, and then 15th is a blue triangle, and then the 16th is here, and that's some of the 16th Battalion, or the Queen. I believe it's this one here. Actually, these guys here are the Queen's own part, just of the Queen's own Cameron Highlanders. Here you can see them here with it's a painting of the Battle of Festubert. I believe it's where it's come from. These guys are some of the Highlanders here. Cameron Highlanders, I believe so. They are, of course, at the time, our guys had the um, bolt action rifles before it was called the Ross rifle. Now the Ross rifles, a lot of units did not get the um, number 3 Mark Ones until 1916. And it was a big failure. The Ross rifle was a large failure because if you get it in mud, if you get any grime or dirt in it, it will jam. The bolt will blow back at you. We've talked about this in other presentations. It's not a very reliable rifle, especially when you're in a complicated situation. It was prone to jamming. It was prone to even blowing the bolt falling out of the rifles, out of the rifle itself, and of course you'd have to firm it back in. Um, it, you'd have to Yeah, sometimes it would blow back and blow fingers off soldiers. It was quite a lot to handle. But in 1916, a lot of the Canadian Corps' rifles became the British number 3 Mark 1s. And of course, a lot of the pattern stuff you see here, the magazine pouches and webbing, the gear is called what they call pattern um, British P08 pattern, pattern 1908. Um, so 1908 canvas gearing. So that'd be um, your like anything from your water bottle, the clothing around your water bottle, or your water bottle, your canteen rather. Yeah, your canteen, your standard small web pack, your small pack, 1916, 1916 dated. Anything of the British Commonwealth was a pattern 1908 pattern gear at the time. Including your canteen kits, your canteen bags, your everything that you've got from your that will hold your for your scabbard, for your bayonet, for your clips of ammunition, and onward. So talking about May 19th, this is General Alderson's force. So this is General Alderson here. So Alderson was E.A.H. Alderson was a experienced lieutenant general. You know, he commanded the 1st Canadian Division upon its arrival in England in October 1914 and would serve as the Canadian Corps' first commander from September 1915 until May 1916. So he's got another year to go in commanding this unit, like the first Corps. Um, so he was in charge of operations even in the South African War as well, the Boer War, 1899-1902. So, and he assumed command, 1st Canadian Division, and when it arrived in England, October 1914. He trained the force in England over the following winter and sacking incompetent officers and improving equipment. And so, then he took the Canadians to France in February 1915 and commanded them during the brutal, confusing fighting at the Second Battle of Ypres, and that was in April 1915. And of course, so with the Ypres salient that being hard, outgunned, outnumbered, facing the first lethal chlorine gas attacks in the history of warfare to this scale. I mean, the division successfully defended the Ypres salient at the cost of 6,000 killed, wounded, and missing. So I mean, and now he is going to he's in command of operations for this unit for the Battle of Festubert. And neither the 1st Canadian Corps nor the Indian Corps had managed to reach their objectives on the 18th of May, but the 1st Canadian Brigade did manage to reduce a gap between the positions of the 2nd and the 7th British Divisions. Relief companies of the 16th Battalion worked through the night in driving rain to consolidate the gains and create a continuous line. The Germans, for their part, credited their heavy artillery fire for stopping the Allied attacks cold. On the night of the 18th and 19th of May, the 2nd Canadian Brigade moved up on the 3rd Brigade's right and took over positions as part of a series of reliefs in which the 2nd and 7th Divisions were replaced by the 51st Highland and 1st Canadian Divisions. The latter two were grouped tactically under the command of General Alderson, and designated Alderson's force, to which were added the divisional artillery of the 2nd and the 7th Divisions. The unusual command arrangement lasted just 4 days. The Indian Corps took over administration of the Canadian and Highland divisions, as Alderson lacked a corps staff and had to disrupt the activities of his divisional headquarters by using his chief staff officer to help run the new temporary corps. The Germans were also busy reorganizing, and all available reserves were being rushed forward to shore up a situation seen as precarious. Company and battalion size units marched and even came by rail, including the 2nd Guard Reserve Division, veterans of the war's earliest battles, brought up as a reserve for the Vimy battles from Alsace on the 14th of May. It relieved the 14th Division and left wing of the 13th Division in stages. In its 55th Reserve and 15th Reserve regiments took over positions opposite the 1st Canadian Division and 2nd British Division. So here's the Mark III Ross rifle. I mean, the Canadian situation worsened at the Battle of Festubert in May 1915 overall, when it failed to make any headway against the Germans despite suffering nearly 2,500 casualties. Another operation a month later, the Second Battle of Gravenchi, caused 366 casualties for no appreciable gain. Despite this, Alderson was promoted to command the entire expeditionary force on the Western Front, now titled the Canadian Corps, when a 2nd Division of it arrived at the front later in 1915. However, Sam Hughes increasingly opposed Alderson's position in Canadian political circles, taking particular offense at Alderson's refusal to accept promotions made by Hughes or Carson of untried Canadian officers, and instead promoting veteran British officers in their place, and Alderson's opposition to the continued use by the Canadian divisions of the Ross rifle. So not only soldiers were frustrated with it, it was, of course, the officers certainly didn't like it because it was unreliable and whatnot, getting them results that they needed for attacking forces. But by early 1916, it had become clear to the troops using it that the mechanism of the Ross rifle was useless, of course. So um, it had certainly become, even before then, not liked by many, and then certainly definitely became useless, continued on in this war. So by early 1916, it became clear they needed to replace it, and in some circumstances, dangerous to soldiers using it in the conditions of the trenches, of course. And its incompatibility with the British Lee Enfield rifle meant that the Canadian troops were continually running out of ammunition. Hughes, however, had invested great political capital in the weapon and refused to countenance a switch to the 303 caliber Lee Enfield. So it uses the same caliber but different has different characteristics, different. See, the problem with this is, and it a lot of it, yes, it's mud and whatnot, which is blamed for it, and that's part of it. The mud in the confined spaces, and it's very tightly made and such. Jamming was blamed on mud and such, and of course, but the real big reason was the British ammunition. It was not the Canadian. The Canadian ammunition worked a bit better. The British ammunition, Canadian issued to Canadian troops, jammed in this rifle. Um, Canadian ammunition was made to close tolerances, and when it arrived in England, a lot was scooped up by the British for machine gun use. The ammunition issued to the Canadians at Ypres was found from lots B14 and B15 made by Burlingham Metals and Munitions Company, which had actually been condemned by British inspectors yet was issued to the Canadians. So the Ross rifle was made the whopping boy of the popping of the whipping boy of the politicians. That's part of it. Was just the ammunition was bad as well. It's not that it was not a great rifle, but again, the mud and the mud and the grime and the close quarters, everything with the dirt and everything certainly did not help this. So 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 the matter really reached a hand when Alderson, newly knighted as a knight commander of the Order of the Bath, circulated a document listing 10 deficiencies with the rifle and claiming 85% of Canadian soldiers no longer wished to use it. Hughes, in response, sent letters to 281 senior military figures backing the Ross and attacking Alderson's character. Alderson responded by ordering all subordinate commanders to prepare reports on the efficiency of the Ross in the field. Carson, on its receipt, sent a copy of this order back to Hughes, along with a note from Turner stating that action is being delayed too long as regards Alderson. So early 1916, they replaced it, and certainly the British ammunition worked in it, even in Canadian produced Enfields as well. So the 20th of May, 1915, more renewed assaults. On the morning of the 20th of May, General Alderson gave orders to renew the advance, hoping to gain 600 to 1,000 yards against objectives sighted 3,000 yards apart. The 51st Highland Division's relief of the 2nd Division was delayed, however, and the 1st Army changed their requirements. At 3 p.m., the 2nd and 3rd Canadian Brigades were ordered to make a fresh assault at 7:45 p.m. The 2nd Brigade towards a point on the map labeled K5, which was a junction between the former and the newly established German front lines. The 3rd Brigade was to simultaneously secure half a mile of that new enemy front line and capture the orchard, now christened Canadian Orchard, as well as the adjoining building marked M10. The Indian Corps was to gain attempt to secure from the Buis and a comprehensive artillery program by every gun and howitzer in the First Army was to precede the operation. And here is them preparing to attack the orchard here. The 16th Battalion, 15th Battalion behind them, 14th Battalion up top, 3rd Canadian Brigade here, 1st Canadian Division, 2nd Canadian Brigade, 8th Battalion, and 10th Battalion here. British front, the 17th of May, 1915 here. By the 31st of May, it's here, so they had come further along that line. Third Brigade attack, which is 20th of May. The attack on the 20th began in broad daylight, the bombardment starting at 4 p.m., 1600 hours, and the attack launching at 7:45 p.m., so 1945 p.m. The 16th Battalion, Canadian Scottish, and 15th Battalion, 48th Highlanders of Canada were designated by the 3rd Brigade as the assault battalions. Lieutenant Colonel Leckie of the 16th protested the order, attacking over open ground and with only a single company detailed to attack Canadian Orchard. Brigadier General Turner replied that the British felt, after the experiences at Aubers Ridge, that night operations restricted the ability of commanders to control troops' movement, and despite the disadvantages of exposure to accurate enemy fire, there was an advantage to be gained by attacking in daylight. The plan was for No. 3 Company to attack the orchard and No. 1 Company to support it. If the orchard was gained, a communication trench leading to the orchard would be used as a covered route to approach the M10, or covered to approach. Okay. No. 3 Company managed to reach the orchard, and despite the enemy being well dug in, the defenders were surprised and evicted, putting the Canadian Scottish within 100 yards of the main German trenches. The attempts to attack M10 were turned back by heavy fire and belt of barbed wire. The Canadian Scottish had made the deepest penetration of any unit of the British First Army during the Battle of Festubert. The Canadian orchard remained in Allied hands until the German offensives in the spring of 1918. The 15th Battalion had as fruitless an attack as number 1 company of the Canadian Scottish, and the Highlanders suffered heavy casualties attacking over open ground into the teeth of machine guns and watchful German artillery observers. Despite using short 20-yard dashes, many men were hit, and though they gained the relative safety of the north breastwork, they were stopped 100 yards beyond it. Supporting companies came up to consolidate the gains after dark. The 2nd Brigade attack, and that's on May 20th. The 8th and the 10th Battalions had moved into the line on the night of the 9th of May as the 2nd Brigade assumed its position in the battle line. The move being completed by 11 p.m., the trenches were found to be in poor condition, and unburied corpses had intended wounded men were found in abundance. Brigadier General Arthur Currie, like the CO of the Canadian Scottish, protested vehemently when the order to attack was received. Originally scheduled for the 21st of May, then cancelled, the attack order was received from the First Army with less than 5 hours' notice on the 20th of May. Currie requested a day's postponement to make better preparations, but Alderson would only confirm the order. Currie noted it was his first major difference of opinion with a superior, and he was left angry and bitter about being forced to take an action he knew to be wrong. With very little time to prepare, the 10th Battalion was selected for the assault on K5. 2 companies to attack from a former German communications trench. The attacking commander of the 10th, Major Percy Guthrie, described K5 as a fort in the German line constructed of concrete sandbags in which numerous machine guns were mounted so as to sweep the ground in every direction. As with the 15th Battalion's attack, the attack on the 10th did not go well. The attack of the 10th did not go well at all, doomed to failure before it started, in the words of the Army's official historian. In an afternoon reconnaissance, Brigadier General Currie had been unable to identify his objective, which was shown as a small circle on the map. A major disadvantage of this method of designating positions was the use of the same symbol regardless of the nature of the feature to be identified. To confuse matters further, the Festubert trench map was full of inaccuracies, with errors in position amounting to as much as 450 yards. Furthermore, it was printed upside down, with the north at the bottom of the sheet and the east on the left. The assembly trenches were badly breached and under fire, as was a shallow communicating ditch which provided the only resemblance of a covered approach to its target. So only resemblance of a covered approach to his target. Currie therefore asked for the attack to be postponed until next day, but was refused. Even his expected fire support was reduced. The original artillery plan had included a blasting of K5 by 2 9.2-inch howitzers. This was cancelled, lest the necessary withdrawal of Canadians from the danger zone near such a bombardment should alert the Germans, who from Aber's Ridge could look right into the First Army's positions. The 10th Battalion's attacking party cleared the communication trench of enemy for 100 yards, but as the brigade bombers emerged in single file into the open, they came under a storm of fire from machine gun course, those machine guns were built up on positions which had been unharmed by the artillery which the Canadians brought upon them. Seeing the leaders all shot down, the company commander halted the suicide advance and ordered the gains made good. There was no record of the number of casualties on the 10th Battalion attack, but a renewed attack was immediately called for dawn on the 21st of May, then postponed until after dark to allow for a proper bombardment. And this is what we're talking about here, them continuing on this proper bombardment on these lines. So the Canadians, their attacks on the 21st of May. The First Army's orders for the renewed attack required Alderson's force to secure both K5 and M10, as well as the intervening stretch of 1,500 yards of front-line trench, which was barring across the Riviere de Overt, which led southeast towards La Bassée. The new front formed a salient with the old front line, and the Germans intended for K5 to be occupied as long as possible until the new front line could be completed, with reinforcements and counterattacks allocated to K5. Since K5 was at the boundary of the 1st Canadian and 47th London Divisions, its left forward battalion also came under command of Brigadier General Arthur Currie. The units on the left were given no orders to expand the gains earned at Canadian Orchard. The strength of the positions at M10 being known, complicated further by the lack of unexposed assembly areas in which troops could prepare for new attacks. The 10th Battalion's Major Guthrie made 3 trips through shell-swept terrain to brigade headquarters, finalizing details for the renewed attack on K5. The communication trench would again be utilized as a jump-off point, and he planned to use the same 2 companies from the night before, splitting them in 2, with his left-hand company assaulting the objective and the right-hand company clearing trenches adjacent. Guthrie realized that success would depend on the ability of the artillery to reduce the German positions before the assault. To that end, a bombardment of 3.5 hours was laid on, beginning at 5 p.m., 1700 hours. Once again, the attack went in while it was still light, and once again, in the words of the Army historian, the bombardment was woefully ineffective. The field guns had been dispersed across the front, and ammunition shortages required them to fire shrapnel shells. Comparatively ineffective against German strongpoints, as opposed to the heavier guns of the siege batteries. So they're firing shrapnel shells against harder targets. It's much more effective to fire high explosive shells, which will blast right through those areas. At least heavily damage fortified positions. Counter-battery artillery fire was still in its infancy, and German guns, heavier and with ample supplies of shells, were able to respond by shelling the Canadian infantry heavily. The 2nd Brigade's assault was made by the same 2 companies of the 10th Battalion, together with the 1st Brigade's grenade company carrying 500 bombs. From breaches cut in the sides of the approach trench, half the force broke out to the left, half to the right. The former, advancing across 200 yards of open ground towards K5, was quickly cut to pieces by machine gun fire. The right-hand party, however, attacking the western face of the salient, met less resistance and drove the enemy out of 400 yards of his front line. During the night, the Germans attempted several counterattacks, which the Canadian garrison, reinforced by a company of the 5th Battalion, drove off. Then, with the coming of daylight on the 22nd, enemy guns began a heavy bombardment of their lost position. Large portions of the breastworks were blown away and the occupants wiped out. Before midday, Curry withdrew his men from all but 100 yards of the newly occupied line. The 10th Battalion had by then suffered casualties of 18 officers and 250 other ranks. On the morning of the 22nd of May, General Haig visited General Alderson to express his dissatisfaction at the failure of the Canadians to achieve their objectives and insist that the Germans be pushed out of their positions. Alderson's force was dissolved, and the 51st Highland Division placed under the command and under the control of the Indian Corps, who finally abandoned their attacks at Femme-de-Bouilly. The 1st Canadian Division went under the direction command of 1st Army. At an Army conference next morning, he ordered a thorough reconnaissance of the enemy's positions before planning the next attack, which would be a combined effort by the Canadian Division and the 47th Division of the 1st Corps, on its right to reduce the German salient opposite. From its apex at K5, this extended 1,500 yards northeast of the orchard and an equal distance southeast to a point opposite Gravinchy-le-Bassé, a hamlet about half a mile from the Le Bassé Canal. The Canadians were to take K5 and get patrols to the northern part of the Route des Hauts-Forts. The British division was to attack towards Chapelle-Sainte-Roche, farther south on the same road. General Haig and a few other commanders here, I believe. Preliminary to the main operation, a night assault astride the south breastwork was made by the inner brigade of the two divisions, and once again the 2nd Canadian Brigade was selected to take on the work of the Canadian Division. However, careful reconnaissance and detailed planning were carried out this time, and the artillery support managed a slow and continuous fire throughout the night. At 2:30 a.m. on 24th of May, 2 companies of the 5th Battalion were led by a party of 30 bomb throwers. Using the battle cry Lusitania, they attacked from the communication trench and front line opposite K15, crossed a 10-foot wide water-filled ditch over a dozen-foot bridges, and managed to seize both K5 and 130 yards of trench stretching to the northwest. It was a costly attack, with 13 of the 18 combatant officers being killed or wounded, 250 casualties in all. The 7th Battalion sent 3 companies forward to reinforce the line, while the 47th Division's attack, which got off 30 minutes later than the 5th Battalion's, reached the near end of the breastwork without capturing any of the enemy's trench. The next night, the Canadians changed their efforts to the left flank, and at 11:30 p.m., a company of the 3rd Battalion moved out from the orchard to attempt to take 300 yards of trench running north from M10. Despite a 6-hour bombardment, 4 German machine guns caught the Canadians at close range, leaving only a handful alive to reach the German trench, all of whom were captured. As final acts, the final Canadians' actions at Festubert were fought by Seeley's detachment, which relieved the 2nd Brigade on the 24th of May. The detachment consisted of the headquarters and dismounted cavalry units of the Canadian Cavalry Brigade. Following the carnage of the 2nd Battle of Ypres, and in response to the desperate need for infantry, the cavalrymen volunteered to serve in France and moved from their training camps in the United Kingdom on the 4th of May, numbering about 1,500 men, leaving behind their horses with British yeomanry units. 1 squadron of Royal Canadian Dragoons received a day of instruction. Otherwise, the 9 squadrons of dismounted troopers had no experience in trench routine or fighting. They went into the line opposite the also newly arrived 91st Reserve Regiment of the 2nd Guard Reserve Division, and on the 25th of May were ordered to cooperate with the 47th Division's attack that evening. Here you can see Festubert. Oh, you can see Festubert here, Givenchy here, and that's Neuve Chapelle we talked about before, Le Basset, and the 1st British Army here. And that's Aubers Ridge. So this is all in relative areas, and there's Lens, captured ground. That's Vimy Ridge down the section here. Arras, the Battle of Arras, and Bethune. And so here we go. This is these are where the last actions are. The British attacked at 6:30 p.m. on 25th of May north of the Givenchy Chapelle Saint Roch road, and 2 battalions advanced 400 yards to take the German forward and support trenches on a 1,000-yard front, suffering 980 casualties in the process. Lord Strathcona's horse contributed a bombing group at 9 p.m. 2100 hours, which worked north from K5, bringing with them 200 gas bombs. As it turns out, the first authorized use of gas in the history of the British Expeditionary Force. They were assisted by bayonet parties, and the Strathconas reported the south breastwork clear from K5 to L8, a point 300 yards northeast, shortly after midnight. The 2nd Brigade sent work parties forward to consolidate, but L8 was found to be occupied by the enemy. The Strathconas had been as confused by the wretched maps as everyone else, and had occupied ground farther west than they believed. The 3rd Brigade, which relieved Seeley Detachment on 27th of May, was given the task of securing L8 and linked the Canadian line with the 47th Division south of K5. And this area here is showing the orchard, and so you can see here St. Croix and Festubert, 1st Canadian and the 47th London Division, and where they are relative to each other in this map. And that's old because that's May 9th, and I put that in the wrong place. So actually no, this is 5 days old. So that's the line, the 9th of May. And then of course here, where you see here, the star is the memorial location. That's the 20th of May. So that is, and then they're pushing up forward. So here, so they're roughly here and up, they're roughly within this area here. From Givenchy Chapelle, and which is, so they're roughly within this, through in here, as Givenchy's down in here. So yes, the maps can be confusing as well on here if I put them in the wrong place. But I think it's okay. On the 31st of May, the 1st Canadian Division began a shift to its right in order to take over a new sector at Givenchy, to the immediate north of the canal, as part of a 1st Army's reorganization, in the wake of Sir John French's decision on 25th of May to stop the Festubert fighting and attempt new missions to assist the French offensive. Major offensives were out of the question due to ammunition shortages, and the open country faced by the First Army did not permit assembly of infantry attacks nor cover for artillery positions. The best option, recommended by General Haig, was a limited operation north of the canal from Givenchy towards Le Basset, possibly followed up with further operations south towards Hessines. In concurring, Sir John French ordered the First Army to take over another divisional sector of the French 10th Army's left, so as to enable Foch, French commander, to reinforce his renewed offensive against Vimy Ridge. For the 1st Canadian Division, as for the other formations of the First Army taking part in the Battle of Festubert, had been a frustrating experience. Substantial gains had been looked for but not achieved. and in the lower echelons where the army's role of easing pressure on the French was little appreciated. Few could readily share the commander-in-chief's view of an objective attained. In the course of the battle, Canadians had assaulted on 5 separate days to advance their line, an average distance of 600 yards across 1 mile front. Except for the capture of a bit of German defenses at 5K, their attacks had not reached the enemy line. In doing this, they had suffered 2,468 casualties. The Canadian division had returned to action a little more than 2 weeks after losing half its fighting strength at Ypres. Far too short a time for units to assimilate their infantry reinforcements. We have noted the inexperience of the dismounted cavalry. Yet no fault can be found with the offensive spirit and the self-sacrifice of the troops, who were called upon to persist in the impossible. Once again, the superiority of the German artillery had decided the issue. The enemy's organized shelling of the front line and support trenches prevented the assembly of troops within reasonable assaulting distance of their objective, and kept the reinforcements from coming forward to exploit initial gains. Our own guns, outclassed in weight and short of high explosive shell, could neither destroy the enemy's field defenses nor silence his batteries. In addition, the German defenders held the advantage in machine guns, trench mortars, and their very effective stick grenades. New tactics were needed to offset the lead thus taken by a nation which had well prepared itself for war. Yet so far, Allied commanders appeared satisfied that success was merely a matter of persistence, and more guns and ammunition. The original history of the Canadian Expeditionary Force described the Battle of Festubert as the most unsatisfactory engagement involving Canadians in the entire war. Half of the infantry who fought there had been fresh from reinforcement camps in the UK and barely arrived from Canada, thrown into action just 3 weeks after horrifying losses at the Second Battle of Ypres. The 1st Division lost 93 officers, 1 in 5 belonged to the 10th Battalion. Though that battalion lost less than a tenth of the 2,230 other ranks. Over establishment early in May, the 10th Battalion was at half strength on the 30th of May. The 16th Battalion had lost 277 men, including 6 officers, 3 of them dead. Number 3 Company had been reduced to just 56 effectives. And here's the town of Festubert. So Gravenchi, and that's on the 15th of June, go a little ahead here. It involves the 7th Division, 1st Canadian Division, 1st Battalion, 2nd Battalion, 4th Battalion, Canadian Expeditionary Forces, and the 134th Saxon Regiment. As the 1st Army reorganized, the 1st Canadian Division found itself as the right wings of the 4th Corps, then holding the center of the Army's front from the La Bassée Canal north to Canadian Orchard. On the left flank of the division was the 7th Division, the 51st Highland Division next in line beyond. And to the left of the Corps was the Indian Corps, holding a 8-mile front. To the south, the 1st Corps held 6 miles of trench in between the canal and the French 10th Army, deploying the 1st and 47th London and 2nd Divisions in the line. The narrow divisional sector afforded by the 4th Corps frontage of just over 2.5 miles permitted 2 brigades to occupy reserve positions and just 1 brigade to man the 1,000-yard front line, which extended north from the canal, over the southwest edge of Huber's Ridge, and encompassing the eastern outskirts of Gravenchi, Les, La Bassée, a shattered village that had seen a successful defensive stand by British troops in December of 1914. The trenches were dry, and the occupation of high ground permitted communications and support trenches out of observation of the enemy, allowing the concentration of troops in assembly areas in secret. No man's land in the Canadian sector varied from 500 yards wide on the right down to 75 yards east of Gravinci, where a semicircular sandbagged parapet, known as the Duck's Bill, protruded toward the enemy's line. On the German side, responsibility for the defense of La Bassée area still rested with the 14th Division. Next to the canal, opposing the Canadians, was the 114th Saxon Infantry Regiment, brought in as a reinforcement, from the 40th Saxon Division, north of Armentières. There was not enough heavy ammunition to proceed with the original plan for attacks on both sides of the canal. The project was therefore reduced to an assault by the Fourth Corps on a very narrow front towards Violines, a village 1,500 yards northwest of Le Bassée, and after several postponements, in order to coordinate with the renewal of the French offensive, the date was set for the 15th of June. General Rawlinson's orders called for an attack by the 7th and 51st Divisions against the line Chapelle de la Roche, Rue de Auvert, with the Canadian Division, rendering such assistance as may be possible without actually assaulting the enemy trench line. But the Canadians could not establish the required protective right flank without breaking through the German front line, and General Alderson's orders of 8th and 12th June provided for an assault by the 1st Brigade on two strong points, H2 opposite the Duck's Bill and H3 150 yards to the north. On this occasion, the Canadians had time for careful preparation, and the preliminary arrangements which they made were to stand as a model for successful major engagements fought later by the Canadian Corps. The artillery available for the Fourth Corps operation had been divided into 5 groups. Covering the Canadian front was a group under Brigade General H.E. Burstow, commander of the Canadian Divisional Artillery, which included 8 4.5-inch and 8 6-inch howitzers, a group of French 75mm guns, and the 2nd and 3rd Brigades Canadian Force CFA, Force Artillery. The 1st Brigade CFA was employed in a group supporting the 7th Division's right. The Canadian 18-pounders had the task of destroying the enemy's wire. Determined that there should be no criticism over uncut wire after the battle, General Burstow insisted that the infantry express themselves as satisfied before the assault. The successive postponements prolonged the task, for the enemy was able to repair some of the breaches by night. As a result, the artillery was forced to exceed the expenditure of ammunition prescribed by the First Army, 6 rounds of shrapnel per yard. Afterwards, the commander of the 1st Brigade reported that the wire on his front was found to have been most satisfactorily dealt with. The constant influx of lessons learned had not ended with Festubert. The need to neutralize enemy forward machine guns was all too apparent after the costly assaults at Festubert. In an attempt to combat enemy machine guns directly, 3 18-pounders were fitted with gun shields from heavy armor plate and silenced with rubber tires. Then grabbed ahead at night. 2 were in place at Duck's Bill, just 75 yards from the German trenches, and a 3rd from a separate battery inside a ruined farmhouse inside of 300 yards away from H3, position H3. The 1st Battalion was able to assemble in relative safety in an assembly trench built by engineers and working parties by mid-afternoon on 15th of June and prepared to make its assault in successive company waves. 2 days earlier, the short magazine Lee Enfield had replaced the Ross rifle throughout the Canadian division. The Ross, a fine weapon for target shooting, had been unpopular for its apparent tendency to jam during rapid firing in battle conditions. The 1st Battalion went into the attack armed completely with British SMLEs, the short magazine Lee Enfields. A slow 2-day artillery bombardment was quickened at 0600 hours into just 12 hours of heavy fire, and at 1745 100 hours 5:45 p.m. 15 minutes before 0 hour, the 3 armored guns were revealed, the 2 at the Duck's Bill blasting the enemy parapet through open sights, and the 3rd holding fire for fear of hitting friendly targets. Machine guns at H3 were thus not affected, and the program of wire cutting by the artillery had led the Germans to anticipate the assault. An immediate and heavy concentration of shells fell on Givenchy, including the Canadian assembly trenches, and the 18-pounders at the Duck's Bill were knocked out of action, though they were able to beforehand to fire 120 rounds, knock out 3 German machine guns, and breach the German parapet. 2 minutes before 0 hour, an enormous mine laid by British engineers was exploded close to the German line. Plans to explode H2 were scrubbed by the discovery of water under no man's land and increased the size of the charge, intended to compensate, did not have the desired effect. H2 was not touched, and a crater over 40 yards wide was created, and bomb reserves in the Canadian front line were either detonated or buried as a result of the massive explosion, causing casualties among the bombing parties of the 1st Battalion. The lead infantry company of the 1st did not wait for the debris to stop raining down before they started their attack, followed by a supporting company with 2 machine guns, which deployed in the enemy's front line trench. As their covering barrage lifted, both companies advanced to the German second line to begin bombing right and left and establishing a block. The 3rd Company crossing no man's land at 6:10 p.m. to occupy the German front line behind them. The 4th Company arrived at 7 p.m. Early reports from the sector of the main attack, where the 7th and 51st Divisions were each assaulting with 2 battalions, indicating the capture of the German front line across the whole of the 4th Corps front. But later it was established that the enemy still held H3. Further north, he was also holding the crater of a mine which the 7th Division had exploded 12 days earlier. And from these 2 positions, his machine gun fire swept no man's land as far south as the Duck's Bill. Thus, he was able to play havoc with the Canadian 3rd and 4th waves, and at the same time cover the reoccupation of his lost trenches. Meanwhile, the 1st Battalion's attempts to bomb northward towards H3 had been halted by German counter-bombing and by the attackers' shortage of grenades. The situation for the Canadians in the enemy's second line became critical, for the 7th Division's failure to advance beyond the opposing front line had left an open flank. To meet a German counterattack, the 1st Battalion's machine gun officer, Lieutenant F. W. Campbell, took one of his guns forward from the enemy's front line. The tripod had been broken, but the only other surviving member of the detachment, Private H. Vincent, supported the weapon on his back while Campbell kept on firing until he fell, mortally wounded. When the last round had been expended, Vincent, who was later awarded the Distinguished Conduct Medal, crawled back to the Canadian lines, dragging his gun behind him. Lieutenant Campbell received the Victoria Cross. The action continued as bombers of the 2nd Battalion, reinforced by 2 platoons of the 3rd Battalion, kept up the fight from the mine crater. A company of the 3rd Battalion, sent forward just before 9 p.m., was held up at the Canadian front line by enemy fire. The 1st Battalion's advance companies, cut off from reinforcements and supplies, were forced to fall back to the German front line trench earlier in the evening, and between 9 p.m. and 10 p.m. the German front line also had to be evacuated. The 1st Battalion had been roughly handled, losing a devastating 20 officers, and 366 for all ranks in total. The 3rd Battalion was ordered in to restore the situation at 11:30 p.m. But uncertainty along the front of the entire corps and the length of time necessary to mount a renewed bombardment caused several postponements. All 3 divisions renewed the attack at 4:45 p.m. on June 16th, following a 2-hour bombardment, the maximum that available ammunition permitted. The enemy was prepared for this renewed attack, and not a single permanent hold could be gained on the German trenches. The enemy simply manned the parapet in the wake of the barrage opposite the 3rd Battalion and letting loose a hail of small arms and machine gun fire. At 9 p.m., the Royal Canadian Dragoons, ordered to try again, were stood down. The 1st Canadian Brigade went into a defensive role, and on 19th of June, Sir John French ordered further attempts to gain ground immediately stopped, noting the French offensive in Artois had come to an end, and any further British actions were no longer required. In the aftermath of this, on the 24th of June 1915, the 1st Canadian Division began another move 17 miles north of Gravinci on the Progstut sector, and a return to the Second Army, the beginning of 3 months of relative inactivity along the entire British front. Defenses were improved, but given the stream of German units to the Eastern Front, the unlikelihood of a major German breakthrough, the building of improved rearward positions was ended. More important were support trenches and well-maintained front-line trenches, and 2,000 men were employed to work parties in every night by the 1st Division. As mortally supporting localities were transformed into strong points, wired and sandbagged, sited for all-round defense and platoon-sized garrisons. The Automobile Machine Gun Brigade, number 1, redesignated 1st Canadian Motor Machine Gun Brigade, arrived from England on the 21st of June, and their heavy machine guns were added to the rearward positions of the division. From late June to mid-September 1915, a strange tranquility persisted across the Canadian front. Apart from the activity of snipers on both sides and one small patrol clash in no man's land. The only hostilities were an occasional exchange of light shelling by the opposite artilleries, which in general confined their attention to the registering targets. On 3 occasions, the Royal Engineers exploded mines in front of the Canadian trenches, and detachments of the 13th Battalion on the 9th and 13th of July, and the 4th Battalion on the 31st of August occupied the resulting craters without difficulty. Mobile anti-aircraft sections formed from the Motor Machine Gun Brigade occasionally engaged enemy aircraft reconnoitering behind the Canadian lines. July brought a visit from Sir Robert Borden, and in August the Minister of Militia, Major General Sam Hughes, spent 2 days with the Canadians, witnessing a shoot by 3 field batteries and reviewing the PPCLI, the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, and the Royal Canadian Horse Artillery. Before the end of September, the arrival of a 2nd Division in France had increased Canadian representation in the field of a full Army Corps. So here are the battle honors. So the following units were granted the Battle Honor of Festubert 1915 for participation: the Canadian Cavalry Brigade, the Royal Canadian Dragoons, Lord Strathcona's Horse, the 1st Canadian Brigade, which consisted of the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, and 4th Battalions of the Canadian Expeditionary Force, the 2nd Canadian Brigade, which consisted of the 5th, 7th, 8th, and 10th Battalions Canadian Expeditionary Force, and the 3rd Canadian Brigades. 3rd Canadian Brigade, so 3 Canadian Brigades, the 13th, 14th, 15th, and 16th Battalion Canadian Expeditionary Forces. So they all got battle honors at Festubert in 1915. So for most conspicuous bravery, on the 15th of June 1915, during the action at Gravinci, Lieutenant Campbell, at the age of 46, took 2 machine guns over the parapet, arrived at the German front line with 1 gun, and maintained his position there under very heavy rifle and machine gun and mortar fire, I believe, notwithstanding the fact that almost the whole of his detachment had then been killed or wounded. When our supply of bombs had become exhausted, this officer advanced his gun still further to an exposed position, and by firing about 1,000 rounds, succeeded in holding back the enemy's counterattack. This very gallant officer was subsequently wounded and has since died, and that's, of course, he received, before that, he received the South African medal with 4 bars, and then, of course, he died at the age of 46, and this was at Gravinci, and he's buried over there, and buried in France, and he was awarded the Victoria Cross, and that's the Victoria Cross recipient of the battles of Festubert and Gravinci. Well, Gravinci is where he was awarded that. So while the Germans lost at Festubert, and maybe even a bit more at Gravinci, around 5,000, the Canadians, launching several frontal attacks, attacking infantry were mowed down by well-positioned enemy machine guns. We lost pretty much 2,468 casualties in a series of largely unsuccessful attacks. And since the Second Battle of Ypres, less than a month earlier, the Canadian division had suffered more than 8,500 casualties. So that's quite a lot for us. I mean, and that was our pretty much baptism of fire on a large degree for the First World War. And this is just the beginning of these battles that I'll be talking about. But okay, all right. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Aaron Boma, military specialist for Carleton County. Thank you very much.